for employees on layoff, what order do they have to be recalled in?
Yes, that's a great question, and this is one thing that hasn't changed since we did that guide back in May of 2020. We saw this great source of confusion that people who had never laid off employees, of course, had never recalled them, and when it came time to start thinking about that, they made all these assumptions. A lot of them were based upon what they've heard about unionized work environments, where it's sort of first laid off, first recalled, or that kind of thing, and they assumed all these rules when really there are very few. The reality is an employer can determine who they are going to recall from either layoff or recall people who have been working from home and recall them back to the workplace. That's in the context of a non-unionized workplace. If it is a unionized workplace, you'll have a collective agreement. They will have very clear rules and processes for all of this. But in the non-unionized workplace, which is where we focus our efforts, the only restriction really is human rights. So generally speaking, you can choose who to recall and when in whatever order you want. It doesn't have to be based upon seniority or how long they were on layoff or anything else. Human rights is the exception. You can't choose based upon any protected ground, such as color of their skin, or disability is probably the most relevant. And disability has been defined to include COVID. So you can't say, and I know people are tempted to say this, that we're not going to bring back people who had COVID, or we're going to make them the last people to bring back. You can't do that. But other than that, you can choose who and when. And this is a bit of an opportunity to assess your workforce and decide who you really need and who are the critical people to have as you go through a reopening process.
Right. I think that is a common misconception that there's this process that has to be followed in terms of recalling workers outside a unionized context. So is there a recall process that employers need to follow when they're not unionized?
Generally, no. You just need to give them notice of the expectation that, and we're talking about two different groups here, the people who are on layoff and the people who are working from home. So if they're on a layoff, you've got to give them notice that they're expected to return to work. If they're working from home, you've got to give them notice that they're expected to return to the workplace. But either way, there is no magic formula, there is no magic form. You just have to be clear about what the expectation is and what the timing is. And of course, if someone's on layoff, they are expected to keep themselves available for work. So if they chose to travel or to relocate or anything like that, they really did so at their own risk because they're going to be expected to return to the workplace pretty quickly. So as Brittany mentioned, what we're trying to do is give you answers but also tips, especially because we haven't done it yet, but many of the answers will be it depends. So we'll try to at least give you some tips to guide you through the process. So in terms of tips, I mentioned this one already, but if you're an employer, think about your workforce. The last 15 or 16 months now have been a time to, especially if you are closed or not operating at full capacity, take stock of your operation, take stock of your workforce, think about who you need, think about the people that you've always wondered about whether they were really pulling their weight or not. Now might be the time to say, we're not going to bring those people back. And we're going to talk about this later on, but then of course you're going to have to treat them fairly. But if you're an employee and you've been on layoff for well over a year at this point, assess, push for a very clear recall date. And if you're not getting one, then you should think about whether you have a claim to make for constructive dismissal. And I know we're going to talk about that in more detail later, but don't just, I think the time has passed to just sit at home and wait. Now's the time to be a bit more proactive.
Right. And I think that's an unfortunate reality for a lot of employees is that they have been sitting at home on layoff with basically no recourse available to them for in some cases over a year. So what about employees who have been working from home productively for the past year? What if they want to continue working from home? Is there any recourse available for employees in that circumstance?
Yeah, so generally speaking, no. And this is another one of those, I think, misconceptions or assumptions that people are making. Because as you said, a lot of people have been, very publicly proclaiming that I've been working from home efficiently, effectively. There's no reason I should go back to the workplace, so I'm just going to continue to work remotely. The reality is that an employer has the right to decide where someone works. That's the general or the default. If your contract says otherwise, that will change things. And the employer can't make a change. So if you were allowed to work from home before the pandemic, that will continue. Basically, the obligation here is to return everything to pre-pandemic conditions. So if you're working in the workplace, you're going to be expected, or you can be expected to return. If you have the right to work from home full time, that should continue. If you have the right to work from home 2 or 3 days a week, that should continue. But generally speaking, the employer has the right to essentially order that you return to the workplace, even if you've been home and working efficiently during the pandemic. And that's where I think a lot of people are really, have gotten themselves into trouble, because we all know people who decided, hey, it's no point in paying the rent or the mortgage in Toronto. I might as well move 300 or 400 kilometers away. I can work remotely. I can work from anywhere. We've all seen those ads about, working in the Grand Cayman and been tempted by things like that. But imagine the surprise when you've got your place in the Grand Cayman or in Kitchener-Waterloo, and all of a sudden you're told to be downtown Toronto on Monday. And that might happen. So for some tips for employees, remember, you can't just decide to relocate. The same way in non-pandemic times, your employer could not just decide to relocate you. You can't just decide to relocate. Nothing has changed since pre-pandemic days. And if you're an employer, know your rights, but also don't be afraid to enforce your rights. I mean, a lot of employers have really been, walking on eggshells and scared to insist that people return to the workplace. And we are still encouraging people. If you have people that can work from home efficiently, it's still the safest way to go. So if you can let your employees continue to work remotely, do so. But if for whatever reason it's best for them to return, don't be hesitant about enforcing your rights.
Yeah, and I just want to pick up on that thread a little bit of, what happens if an employee has actually moved away, like they've physically relocated. I mean, what happens in situations like that?
Yeah, and where someone lives doesn't matter. I've been working with an employer recently where they have someone who is contemplating moving across the country. And, the messaging that we've helped them to craft is, look, we don't care where you live. If you want to buy a home across the country and rent an apartment near the workplace, or if you want to commute every weekend or every week, that's up to you. But you're expected to be at the workplace from Monday to Friday, for your regular hours. So the bottom line is, you can't change the terms. The same way the employer can't change them, you can't change them. And you may be expected to return to the workplace. You can always try to negotiate, and we've certainly helped a lot of our clients engage in those proactive discussions, and on both sides of the fence. So there may be negotiations there, but don't assume that you're going to be able to work remotely forever. And from the employer's perspective, if you have someone who is not coming back to work, or has told you they're not going to come back to the workplace, you need to document this very strategically. And we've worked with a number of clients to go through this process. And there's a great case that just came out really recently, which is related. In that case, you had an employee who was on medical leave, and they were asked to provide documentation to support the leave, and for whatever reason refused to do so. And ultimately, the employer just deemed them to have abandoned their job. And the individual sued for wrongful dismissal and won. And part of the judge's analysis was that although they had requested medical documentation and the employee had refused to provide it, they were never given clear warning that this refusal or this failure to provide documentation would lead to them being deemed to have abandoned their job. They weren't told of the consequences. So it's a lot of employers will say this is just ridiculous, but it is the nature, and it's always been the nature of our employment laws, that employees generally need to have clear warning of the consequences of their misconduct, whatever that misconduct might be. So in this context, if you have an employee who is not returning to work, or even if you just know they've moved far away and you're concerned they're not going to return to work, give them that recall warning and make it very clear that if they don't return, then they're going to be deemed to have abandoned their job. And then you can paper the situation properly, and then eventually you can get to that point where you can terminate the employment relationship.
Speaking of papering situations properly, one of the questions that we've been getting quite a lot from our clients is, can you ask an employee to sign a new contract of employment when you recall them to work?
Yeah, we have been getting that a lot, and it's interesting because I guess in a way it makes me feel good, because I think our message that you should always have your employees sign contracts is getting through to people. So that's right. Kind of nice to hear. The problem is they're not necessarily doing it at the right time and in the right context. You can't just say you're being recalled to work, but before you come back you have to sign this contract. That's not going to fly. So as we've talked about many times, in order to have a binding contract, there has to be consideration flowing both ways. In other words, I'm going to give you something, you're going to give me something. Quid pro quo, as we often say. And when we have employer clients who want to have existing employees and want to have them sign a new contract, we always explain you've got to give them some new benefit. So it could be a promotion, it could be a signing bonus, it could be an increase in salary, or in this context, and I will credit one of our clients for coming up with that idea. I thought it was very clever. What he said was, if I have an employee who wants to continue working from home, can I say that, yes, we'll allow you to do so in exchange for your agreement to sign a new contract? You're giving them a benefit. So I think that's absolutely valid consideration. So simple answer to your question is you can't just require they sign a new contract. But if you can offer them something in exchange for doing so, which could be the ability to work from home, either full-time or even part-time, that could get you in a situation where you've now got a binding agreement in place that will be to your benefit. So employers, getting back to our idea of giving you tips, use this opportunity. Think about how you might be able to get an employee that is going to be coming back from layoff or from working from home to sign a new contract. And for employees, and we always have this discussion as well, be very cautious about what you're being asked to sign, because I'll say 99 times out of 100, if your employer is asking you to sign a new contract, it's not for your benefit. So make sure you know what you're signing before you sign it.